The ink-stained fingers of Harrison Blake trembled as he folded the first letter, addressed to a woman whose face he had never seen but whose words had already begun to change his life in ways he could not yet understand. It was 1881, and Harrison had been working as a ranch hand near Prescott, Arizona Territory, for 3 years when his friend Charlie suggested he place an advertisement in the Philadelphia newspaper for correspondence. Charlie had found his own bride that way, a sweet-tempered woman named Martha who had made the journey west 2 summers prior, and now kept a tidy home on the edge of town. Harrison was 24 years old, weathered by the sun and hardened by the demanding work of cattle drives and fence mending. But inside, he carried a loneliness that seemed to grow heavier with each passing season. His parents had died of fever when he was 17, leaving him with nothing but a worn Bible and his father's old saddle. He had drifted from Texas through New Mexico and finally settled in Arizona, always moving, never quite finding a place that felt like more than just another stop along an endless trail. The advertisement cost him nearly a week's wages, but Charlie assured him it was worth every cent. "A good woman makes a man's life worth living," Charlie had said, clapping him on the shoulder. "You cannot just work yourself into the ground and call that a life, Harrison. You need someone to come home to." 3 months passed before he received his first response. The letter arrived at the general store in town, handed to him by old Mr. Peterson, who managed the post. Harrison had almost forgotten about the advertisement, had convinced himself that no respectable woman would want to correspond with a ranch hand who had nothing to offer but calloused hands and a bunk in a shared cabin. Her name was Grace Thompson, and she was 22 years old, living in Philadelphia with her aunt and uncle. Her father had been a printer who died when she was 15, leaving debts that swallowed up everything the family owned. Her mother had passed in childbirth years before that, taking the baby with her. Grace wrote with a clear, elegant hand that spoke of education and refinement, but there was also a warmth in her words that made Harrison's chest tighten with something he had not felt in years, perhaps ever. She did not write of fancy things or make demands. Instead, she asked him about his life, about the Arizona Territory, about what the sky looked like at sunset, and whether the stars seemed brighter in the west. Harrison sat in the bunkhouse that night, a single lantern casting shadows across the rough wooden walls, and he wrote back. He told her about the mountains that ringed the valley, how they turned purple and gold in the fading light. He described the way the air smelled after a rare desert rain, clean and sharp and full of promise. He wrote about the horses he worked with, the stubborn old mare named Daisy who would only let him handle her, and the young colt he was training who showed real promise. He did not write about the loneliness or the hard years, not yet. Instead, he tried to paint a picture of the life he lived, hoping she might see something in it worth knowing more about. Her second letter arrived 6 weeks later, and it was longer than the first. Grace told him about her work as a seamstress, how she spent her days in her aunt's parlor making dresses for wealthy women who barely acknowledged her existence. She wrote about feeling trapped in a city that seemed to grow smaller every day, where the soot from factories stained everything gray, and the noise never stopped, not even at night. She confessed that she dreamed of open spaces and silence, of a place where she could see the horizon in every direction. "I feel as though I am waiting for my life to begin," she wrote, "as though everything up until now has been a preface to a story I have not yet read." Harrison read that line over and over until he had memorized it. He understood exactly what she meant because he felt the same way, had felt it for years without knowing how to put it into words. That night, he wrote her a longer letter than he had ever written to anyone, telling her about his childhood in Texas, about losing his parents, about the years of drifting. He told her things he had never spoken aloud, thoughts and feelings he had kept locked away, because there had never been anyone who might understand them. The months passed, and the letters became more frequent. Grace wrote every 2 weeks, and Harrison responded the moment each letter arrived. He learned that she loved to read, that she borrowed books from the lending library, and stayed up late into the night turning pages by candlelight. She told him about her favorite novel, about poems that moved her to tears, about the stories she invented in her head when the work of sewing became too monotonous to bear. Harrison had never been much of a reader beyond the occasional newspaper, but he found himself going into town and purchasing a book of poetry she had mentioned, struggling through the verses just so he could write to her about them and understand what she loved in the words. Grace learned about his work, about the ranch and the cattle drives, about the dangerous moment when a rattlesnake had spooked his horse, and he had been thrown, breaking 2 ribs. She wrote back with such concern that Harrison felt guilty for worrying her, but also strangely warmed by the knowledge that someone cared whether he was hurt or well. She sent him a handkerchief she had embroidered with his initials, a gift that arrived wrapped in brown paper and string. Harrison kept it folded in his breast pocket, close to his heart, and sometimes when the work was particularly hard or the loneliness particularly sharp, he would take it out and look at the careful stitches, proof that somewhere far away, someone was thinking of him. A year passed, then 18 months. The letters became the center of Harrison's life, the thing he looked forward to above all else. He knew Grace's thoughts and dreams better than he knew his own. He knew that she was kind to stray cats, that she had once nursed a wounded bird back to health, that she could not stand the taste of licorice but loved peppermint. He knew that her aunt was cold and critical, that her uncle drank too much, that she felt like a burden in their household despite working long hours at her sewing to contribute to expenses. He knew that she was brave and hopeful and perhaps a little bit lonely, just like him. Harrison began to save his money in earnest. Every spare dollar went into a tin box he kept hidden under his bunk. He worked extra hours when they were offered, took on the jobs other ranch hands avoided. Charlie noticed and asked him about it one evening as they sat outside the bunkhouse smoking. "I am going to ask her to come west," Harrison said, watching the smoke curl up toward the darkening sky. "I am going to ask her to marry me." "You have never even met her," Charlie pointed out, but his tone was not unkind. "I know her better than I have ever known anyone," Harrison replied. "I know what matters. I know her heart." Charlie was quiet for a moment, then he nodded. "Then you should ask her. But you will need more than what you have in that tin box of yours. You will need a home to bring her to, not just a bunk in a shared cabin." Harrison knew Charlie was right. He began looking for other work, something that would pay better and give him a future. The opportunity came from an unexpected source. The owner of the ranch, a gruff but fair man named Samuel Wright, called Harrison into his office one afternoon and made him an offer. "I am getting too old for all this," Samuel said, gesturing vaguely at the papers scattered across his desk. "My sons have no interest in ranching. They want to go back east, become businessmen. I need someone I can trust to manage things here, someone who knows the work and the land. I have been watching you, Blake. You are steady and you work hard. I want to offer you the job of foreman. It comes with a house, the old adobe place down by the creek, and a decent salary. What do you say?" Harrison could barely believe what he was hearing. The position would change everything. He would have a real home, a future, something to offer Grace beyond empty promises and dreams. He accepted immediately, shaking Samuel's hand with a grip that made the older man laugh. "You look like I just handed you the whole territory," Samuel said. I hope you prove me right in trusting you." "I will, sir," Harrison promised. "You will not regret this." The adobe house needed work, but it had good bones. It sat on a small rise overlooking a creek that ran clear most of the year, surrounded by cottonwood trees that provided shade in the brutal summer heat. Harrison spent every spare moment fixing it up, patching holes in the walls, replacing broken shutters, scrubbing years of dust and neglect from the floors. Charlie and Martha helped, bringing over furniture they no longer needed, curtains Martha sewed herself, a sturdy table and chairs that had belonged to Martha's parents. When the house was as ready as he could make it, Harrison sat down and wrote the most important letter of his life. His hand shook as he formed the words, and he went through 3 drafts before he was satisfied. He told Grace about the new position, about the house, about the life he could offer her. Then, with his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest, he asked her to come to Arizona and marry him. "I know we have never met in person," he wrote, "and I know that what I am asking is a great risk for you, but I believe we know each other in the ways that matter most. I know your kindness and your courage. I know your dreams and your fears. You know mine. I cannot promise you luxury or an easy life, but I can promise you honesty and devotion and a home where you will always be cherished. I love you, Grace. I have loved you since your 3rd letter when you described feeling like you were waiting for your life to begin. My life did not begin until I read your 1st letter, and it will not be complete until you are here beside me. Please say yes. Please come west and be my wife." He mailed the letter, and then endured the longest 6 weeks of his life. He threw himself into his work, managing the ranch hands, overseeing the cattle, riding the fence lines until he was so exhausted he could barely see straight. It was the only way to keep from going mad with waiting. When the letter finally arrived, his hands shook so badly he could barely open it. He stood in the general store, unable to wait even long enough to walk outside, and unfolded the pages. "Yes," Grace had written. "Yes, Harrison, I will come. I will marry you. I am terrified and excited and happier than I have been in longer than I can remember. My aunt thinks I have lost my mind, and perhaps I have, but it is the best thing I have ever done. I will take the train as far as it goes and then the stage from there. I should arrive in Prescott on the 15th of September. I will be the woman in the blue traveling dress carrying a brown leather case. I cannot wait to finally meet you, to hear your voice, to begin our life together. With all my love, Grace." September 15th was 6 weeks away. Harrison counted the days like a man counting down to his own salvation. He prepared the house with even more care, making sure everything was perfect. He bought new blankets for the bed, dishes for the kitchen, a rocking chair for the porch because Grace had mentioned once in a letter that she had loved sitting in her grandmother's rocking chair as a child. He purchased a new shirt and had his only suit cleaned and pressed. He got his hair cut and his boots polished. Charlie teased him mercilessly but also helped him prepare, offering advice on everything from what flowers to bring to what to say when he first saw her. "Just be yourself," Martha advised kindly when she caught him pacing outside their house one evening. "She is not coming here to meet some polished gentleman. She is coming to meet you, Harrison. The you she knows from your letters. Do not try to be anyone else." The morning of September 15th dawned clear and bright, the sky that brilliant blue that only seemed to exist in the high desert. Harrison rode into Prescott hours before the stage was due, unable to sit still at the ranch any longer. He waited outside the stage office, alternately standing and sitting on the bench outside, his heart hammering in his chest. Other people came and went, going about their business, completely unaware that Harrison's entire world was about to change. The stage was late, held up by a broken wheel that had to be replaced, and each additional minute of waiting felt like an hour. Harrison's mind spun with worries. What if she took one look at him and regretted everything? What if he was nothing like she imagined? What if the reality of the West of him was too much and she got right back on the stage and returned to Philadelphia? Then the stage rounded the corner, dust billowing behind it, the driver calling out to the horses. It pulled to a stop in front of the office, and Harrison stood frozen, barely breathing. The door opened and an older man climbed out, then a younger man carrying a sample case. Harrison's heart sank for a moment, but then a hand appeared in the doorway, gloved in gray cotton, and the driver helped a woman down the steps. She wore a blue traveling dress, somewhat wrinkled from the journey, and carried a brown leather case in her free hand. Her hair was dark, pinned up beneath a simple hat, and when she looked around, scanning the faces of the people gathered at the station, Harrison saw that her eyes were the color of creek water in sunlight, gray-green and clear. She was not beautiful in the way that stopped traffic or launched ships, but there was something about her face, an openness and intelligence and warmth, that made Harrison's breath catch in his throat. Their eyes met, and he saw her expression change, saw the uncertainty become recognition, become something that looked almost like relief. He stepped forward, moving toward her without conscious thought, and she set down her case and moved toward him. They stopped a few feet apart, suddenly awkward, two people who had shared their deepest thoughts and feelings but had never exchanged so much as a handshake. "Grace," Harrison said, and his voice came out rough. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Grace Thompson." "Harrison Blake," she replied, and there were tears in her eyes, but she was smiling. "I would know you anywhere. You look exactly as I imagined, only more so." He did not know who moved first. Maybe they both did at the same time. But suddenly, the distance between them was gone and Grace was in his arms and Harrison was holding her, and it felt like coming home. It felt like the end of a long journey he had not known he was taking, like finding something he had not known he was looking for. She fit perfectly against his chest, her head tucked beneath his chin, and she was warm and solid and real, more real than anything had been in his entire life. "You are here," he said into her hair, breathing in the scent of her, something floral and clean beneath the dust of the journey. "You are really here." "I am here," she agreed, and her voice was muffled against his shirt. "I am here, Harrison." They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other while the world continued around them, people collecting luggage and greeting family and going about their business. Finally, Harrison forced himself to step back, though he kept one of her hands clasped in his. "Was the journey very terrible?" he asked, studying her face, still hardly able to believe she was real and standing in front of him. "Long," she said, "and dusty and hot and uncomfortable. And I do not care about any of it because I am here now and you are exactly as your letters promised you would be." "I was so afraid," he admitted. "Afraid you would take one look at me and change your mind." Grace reached up with her free hand and touched his cheek, her fingers gentle against his sun-weathered skin. "I could never," she said softly. "Harrison, I have been waiting my whole life to feel this way. I am not changing my mind." They were married 3 days later by the circuit preacher, who happened to be passing through Prescott. Charlie and Martha stood as witnesses, and a handful of other ranch hands and townspeople attended, curious about the bride from back east who had come all this way to marry a man she had never met. Grace wore a simple cream-colored dress that Martha helped her make from fabric they purchased at the general store, and Harrison wore his clean suit with a new string tie. The ceremony was brief and to the point, the preacher apparently having several other stops to make before nightfall, but Harrison barely heard the words anyway. He was too focused on Grace, on the way the afternoon light caught in her hair, on the slight tremor in her hand when she placed it in his, on the way she smiled at him when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife. The ride out to the ranch was quiet, both of them suddenly shy now that they were married, now that they would be alone together. Harrison pointed out landmarks along the way, the rock formation that looked like a sleeping giant, the place where he had once seen a mountain lion, the turnoff that led to Charlie and Martha's place. Grace listened and asked questions and looked at everything with wide eyes, taking in the vast open spaces, the mountains in the distance, the endless sky. "It is so much bigger than I imagined," she said at one point. "So much space. I feel like I can finally breathe." When they arrived at the house, Harrison insisted on carrying her over the threshold despite her laughing protests that it was old-fashioned and silly. Inside, she walked slowly through the rooms, touching things, examining the furniture, the curtains, the dishes in the kitchen. She paused in the bedroom doorway, looking at the bed with its new blankets, and Harrison saw her swallow hard. "Are you hungry?" he asked, giving her space, understanding that she might need time. "I am not much of a cook, but I can manage bacon and beans, and Martha sent us home with a basket of food." "I am starving," Grace admitted, turning to face him. "I was too nervous to eat much on the journey." They moved around the kitchen together, unpacking Martha's basket, setting the table, heating coffee. It should have been awkward, this first domestic task together, but instead it felt natural, as though they had done this 100 times before. They talked while they worked, falling back into the easy conversation of their letters. Grace told him about the final days in Philadelphia, about her aunt's dire predictions, and her uncle's surprising gift of $20 for her journey. Harrison told her about preparing the house, about his terror that she would not like it, about the work that was waiting for him at the ranch. After they ate, they sat on the porch in the last light of the day, watching the sky turn through shades of gold and pink and purple. Grace sat in the rocking chair Harrison had bought, gently moving back and forth, and Harrison leaned against the porch rail watching her. "What are you thinking?" he asked finally. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I am thinking that I was right. That everything before this was just waiting. This is where my life begins, here with you." Harrison moved to kneel beside her chair, taking both her hands in his. "I will do everything I can to make you happy," he promised. "I know this is not the life you were raised to, and it will be hard sometimes, but I swear to you, Grace, I will spend every day trying to be worthy of the chance you have taken on me." "Harrison," she said gently, and she freed one hand to cup his face again, the gesture already becoming familiar. "You already are. You already have been from the very first letter. I did not come here hoping you would prove yourself worthy. I came here because I already know you are. I know your heart. That is all that matters." He kissed her then, their first kiss, and it was gentle and sweet and filled with promise. When they finally went inside and closed the door behind them, leaving the desert night to its own devices, Harrison felt a sense of peace he had never known before. He was home, truly home, and Grace was with him, and the lonely years were finally over. The first weeks of marriage were an adjustment for both of them. Grace had never run a household by herself before, had always worked under her aunt's critical eye. Harrison had lived in bunkhouses and bachelor quarters for years, and had forgotten what it was like to share space with another person. But they learned together, making mistakes and laughing about them, figuring out their own rhythms and routines. Grace proved to be more adaptable than even she had expected. She learned to cook on the wood stove, to draw water from the well, to tend the small vegetable garden that Martha helped her plant. She learned to ride, though tentatively at first, on the old mare Daisy, who seemed to sense that this rider needed patience. Harrison came home each day to find her doing something new, exploring her new world with a determination that made him love her even more. She made the house into a home, adding touches that transformed the bare adobe structure into something welcoming. She sewed curtains that actually matched, made cushions for the chairs, arranged wildflowers in jars on the table. She organized his few books and added her own, creating a small library on the shelves he built for her. She wrote letters to Martha thanking her for her help and kindness, and soon the two women became genuine friends, visiting back and forth several times a week. Harrison found himself rushing through his work each day, eager to get home to Grace. He would ride up to the house and see the lamp already lit in the window, smoke rising from the chimney, and feel his heart lift with a joy he had not known was possible. They would eat dinner together and talk about their days, then sit on the porch or by the fire, depending on the weather, and simply be together. Sometimes Grace would read aloud while Harrison worked on tack or other small repairs. Sometimes they would just talk, continuing the conversations they had started in letters, going deeper now that they could see each other's faces, hear each other's voices. The physical aspect of their marriage unfolded gradually, with tenderness and patience on both sides. They were both inexperienced and sometimes awkward, but they were patient with each other, learning what brought pleasure, what felt right. Grace surprised Harrison with her passion, with the way she came alive in his arms, and he surprised her with his gentleness, with the way he paid attention to her needs and desires. They grew into each other, fitting together in ways that felt inevitable and perfect. As autumn turned toward winter, Grace began to talk about her dreams for their future. She wanted to expand the garden in the spring, maybe get some chickens. She wanted to learn to make cheese and butter, to preserve fruit and vegetables for the winter months. She talked about maybe taking in sewing work if any of the ranch wives needed help, not because they needed the money, but because she enjoyed the work and wanted to feel useful beyond just caring for their home. Harrison listened and encouraged her, loving the way her eyes lit up when she talked about plans, about building a life. He told her about his own dreams, about eventually saving enough to buy their own small piece of land, about building up a herd of their own cattle. They dreamed together, weaving their separate hopes into something shared and stronger. Winter in the high desert was cold but beautiful, the mountains dusted with snow that sometimes drifted down into the valley. They spent long evenings by the fire, warm under blankets, talking and reading and simply being close. Harrison taught Grace to play checkers, and she taught him to play a card game her father had loved. They celebrated Christmas with Charlie and Martha, exchanging small handmade gifts, and Harrison surprised Grace with a beautiful shawl he had purchased from a traveling merchant, soft wool-dyed deep blue. "You should not have spent so much," Grace protested, but she was clearly delighted, wrapping the shawl around her shoulders and pressing her face against the soft fabric. "You deserve beautiful things," Harrison told her. "You deserve everything I can give you and more." In January, Grace began to feel unwell in the mornings, and by early February they were certain she was pregnant. The news filled Harrison with a joy so intense it was almost frightening. He became even more protective of Grace, worrying about her constantly, trying to do all the heavy work around the house so she would not strain herself. Grace laughed at his fussing but was also touched by it, by the evidence of how much he cared. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," she reminded him gently when he tried to insist she stay in bed all day. "I am not made of glass, Harrison. I need to move and work within reason. It is better for me and for the baby." Martha, who had 3 children of her own, became Grace's guide through the pregnancy, offering advice and reassurance and practical help. The 2 women grew even closer, and Harrison was grateful beyond words that Grace had found such a good friend in this new place. As Grace's belly grew, Harrison found himself talking to the baby, pressing his ear against her stomach to listen for movement, marveling at the kicks and turns he could feel beneath his palm. They argued playfully about names, each proposing increasingly ridiculous options just to make the other laugh, but they both knew they would wait until they saw their child to make the final decision. The summer heat was intense, and Grace struggled with it in the later months of her pregnancy. Harrison did everything he could to make her comfortable, bringing her cool water from the well, making sure the house stayed as shaded as possible, sitting with her on the porch in the evenings when the air finally cooled. She was uncomfortable and tired, but also radiant, glowing with health and happiness. "I never imagined I could be this happy," she told him one evening as they sat watching the sunset. "Even with how uncomfortable I am right now, even though I feel like I am as big as a house and cannot possibly grow any larger, I am so happy, Harrison. You have given me everything I ever wanted." "You gave me everything first," he replied, taking her hand carefully, always so careful with her now. "You saved my life, Grace. Before you, I was just existing, going through the motions. You made me want to actually live." The baby came in early August, born in the bedroom of their adobe house with Martha attending and Charlie pacing outside with Harrison, both men useless and anxious. It was a long labor, and Harrison aged years in those hours, listening to Grace's cries, wishing desperately that he could do something, anything, to help her. But when Martha finally opened the door and invited him in, when he saw Grace exhausted but smiling, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in soft cotton, everything else fell away. "A boy," Grace said softly. "We have a son, Harrison." The baby was small and red-faced and absolutely perfect. Harrison took him carefully, terrified he might break this precious tiny person, and looked down into a wrinkled face that already seemed to hold infinite possibility. His son, his and Grace's son. "Henry," Harrison said, looking up at Grace. "After my father, Henry Blake. If that is all right with you." "Henry," Grace repeated, testing the name. "Yes, it is perfect." Little Henry was a good baby, content and healthy, and he bound Harrison and Grace even closer together. They took turns walking him at night when he fussed, both of them exhausted, but also marveling at this new life they had created. Harrison had never imagined himself as a father, but he found he loved it, loved watching Henry grow and change, loved the way the baby's face lit up when he saw Harrison come home each evening. Grace bloomed in motherhood, her natural warmth and patience serving her well. She sang to Henry, told him stories, carried him around the house and garden, showing him everything, narrating their life together. Harrison would come home and find them in the garden, Grace with Henry strapped to her chest in a sling Martha had shown her how to make, talking to him about the tomatoes or the beans as though he could understand every word. The years unfolded with a sweetness Harrison had not known existed in the world. Henry grew into a sturdy toddler with his mother's eyes and his father's stubborn determination. A second child arrived when Henry was 3, a daughter they named Hope, who was fierce and fearless from the beginning. Then another son, James, when Hope was 2, quiet and thoughtful and gentle. Harrison's position at the ranch became even more secure as the years passed. Samuel Wright retired completely, moving to Tucson to live with his daughter, and signed over a significant portion of the ranch, to Harrison in recognition of his years of loyal service and skilled management. Harrison and Grace finally had their own land, their own herd, a future that was solid and real and better than anything Harrison had dared dream of in those lonely years before the letters began. They built a larger house on a beautiful piece of land overlooking the valley, with room for their growing family and the children they hoped might still come. Grace had her big kitchen and a parlor with windows that let in the morning light, perfect for her sewing. Harrison had a study where he kept the ranch accounts, and more importantly, where he kept all of Grace's letters, tied with string and stored in a wooden box he had made specially for them. Sometimes on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, Harrison would take out the letters and read them, marveling at the journey they represented. Grace would watch him, smiling at the memories, at how young they had both been, how uncertain and hopeful. "You ever regret it?" Harrison asked her once. "Leaving everything you knew to come west to marry a man you had never met?" Grace was quiet for a moment, then she shook her head. "Never. Not for a single moment. Every word I wrote in those letters was true, Harrison. I was waiting for my life to begin. And it did, the moment I stepped off that stage and into your arms. That was the moment everything became real and right and exactly as it was meant to be." "I love you," Harrison said, pulling her close. "I have loved you since that third letter, and I will love you until the day I die and beyond." "I love you too," Grace replied, "more than words in any letter could ever express." The years continued to be good to them. Their ranch prospered, their children grew healthy and strong. Henry proved to have a gift with horses, gentle and patient like his father. Hope was fierce and independent, always the first to try something new. James was the reader, always with his nose in a book, asking endless questions about everything. A fourth child arrived when James was 5. Another daughter they named Clara, who had Grace's dark hair and Harrison's blue eyes. She was the baby of the family, spoiled by her older siblings and doted on by both parents, but somehow managing not to be spoiled rotten, growing up sweet and kind and generous. Harrison watched his children grow with a sense of profound gratitude. He taught them to ride and rope, to read the weather and the land, to work hard and treat people fairly. Grace taught them letters and numbers, read to them every night, instilled in them a love of learning and beauty and goodness. Together, they created a home filled with love and laughter and warmth. The kind of home neither of them had really known as children, the kind of home they had both dreamed of in those letters that brought them together. Charlie and Martha remained their closest friends, their children growing up together, the two families celebrating every holiday and milestone together. Martha always told newcomers the story of how Harrison and Grace met, how they had written letters for nearly 2 years before Grace came west, how their first embrace had been like watching two halves of a whole finally come together. "It was like they had known each other forever," Martha would say. "Like they had just been waiting to find each other. I have never seen two people fit together so perfectly." When Henry was 15, he asked his father about the letters. Harrison took him into his study and showed him the box, let him read some of them, the ones that were not too private or personal. "I do not understand," Henry said, looking confused. "You married Mother without ever meeting her. How did you know it would work?" "I knew her heart," Harrison said simply. "That was what mattered, not her face or her voice or anything else you might learn from meeting someone in person. I knew what kind of person she was, what she valued, what she dreamed about. I knew her in the ways that matter most. And she knew me the same way. When we finally met in person, when I held her for the first time, it just confirmed what we both already knew. We belonged together." Henry was quiet for a moment, turning one of the letters over in his hands. "It seems risky," he said finally. It was, Harrison agreed. It was terrifying. But the best things in life usually are. Your mother took an enormous risk coming out here to marry me. She left everything she knew behind, but we both believed in what we had built together through those letters. We believed in each other. And we were right to believe. That conversation stayed with Harrison, made him realize how much he wanted his children to understand not just the facts of their parents' marriage but the deeper truth of it. So he began to tell them stories about his lonely years before Grace, about the day he placed the advertisement, about waiting for the first response. He told them about falling in love with words on a page, with the person behind those words, with the heart and mind that expressed themselves so clearly through ink and paper. Your mother saved me, he would tell them. I was lost before her, just drifting. She gave me a reason to build a life instead of just surviving. She gave me a home, not just a house but a real home, a place where I belonged. And I hope I gave her the same thing. Grace would smile when she heard him talking to the children like this, would add her own perspective, her own memories of those months of letter writing, of the decision to come west, of seeing Harrison for the first time. I was so nervous, she would tell them. I kept thinking, what if he is disappointed? What if I am not what he expected? But then I saw him standing there and something in me just knew this was right. This was what I had been waiting for. And when he held me, when we embraced for the first time, it was like I had finally arrived where I was meant to be. Like I had been traveling my whole life and had finally come home. The children loved these stories, asked to hear them over and over, and Harrison and Grace never tired of telling them. It was their story, the foundation of their family, and they wanted their children to understand where they came from, what kind of love had created the home they grew up in. As the children grew older and began to think about their own futures, Harrison noticed that they approached relationships differently than many of their peers. They were not interested in superficial attractions or hasty decisions. They wanted what their parents had, that deep connection, that sense of truly knowing another person. Henry courted a young woman for 2 years before proposing, and when he did, he explained to his father that he wanted to be absolutely certain, wanted to know her as well as Harrison had known Grace before they married. I am not saying we need to write letters for years, Henry said with a smile. But I want to know Rebecca's heart the way you knew Mother's. I want to be sure. Harrison clapped his son on the shoulder, pride swelling in his chest. That is wise, he said. That is exactly right. One by one, the children grew up and began their own lives. Henry took over much of the ranch work, proving himself a skilled and thoughtful manager. He married his Rebecca and built a house on the far side of the property, near enough to help with the ranch, but far enough to have privacy and independence. Hope, true to her fierce nature, announced at 18 that she wanted to go to California and become a teacher. Harrison and Grace were nervous about letting her go so far away, but they also knew better than to try to cage their strong-willed daughter. They helped her make the journey safely, and she wrote them long letters about her adventures, echoes of the letters that had brought Harrison and Grace together in the first place. James went to university in Tucson, studying law, and Clara, the youngest, stayed home the longest, helping her mother and learning everything Grace could teach her about running a household, about sewing and cooking and all the practical skills that had served Grace so well. The years passed, bringing changes and challenges but also continued blessings. Harrison's hair went gray, then white. Grace developed lines around her eyes and mouth, marks of a life spent smiling and laughing. Their bodies aged and slowed, but their love remained constant, deepening with each passing year. They became grandparents first when Henry and Rebecca had a daughter, then a son. More grandchildren followed, from Hope, who returned from California with a husband and 2 children, from James, who married a woman he met at university and settled in Prescott, from Clara, who married the son of a neighboring rancher and stayed close to home. Harrison and Grace's home became the center of the extended family, the place where everyone gathered for holidays and celebrations. The house was always full of noise and laughter, children running through the rooms, grandchildren climbing into Harrison's lap begging for stories, gathering around Grace in the kitchen hoping for cookies or sweets. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered for a celebration. There was a huge meal, with tables set up in the yard, and afterwards, the children and grandchildren surprised them with a gift. It was a quilt, pieced together by all the women in the family, each square embroidered with a quote from one of Harrison and Grace's letters. The letters themselves had become family legend, and somehow the women had convinced Harrison to let them read through and select meaningful passages. Grace cried when she saw it, running her hands over the squares, reading the words she had written so many years ago, the words Harrison had written back. "For everything that matters, we know each other's hearts," one square read. "I feel like my life is finally beginning," read another. "You are my home," read a third. "This is the most beautiful gift I have ever received," Grace said, her voice thick with tears. "Thank you, all of you. This means more than you can possibly know." That night, after everyone had gone home, Harrison and Grace sat on their porch wrapped in the quilt, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The same stars that had been there the night Grace arrived, the night they married, every night of their life together. 25 years, Grace said softly. "It has gone by so fast, but also when I think back to those days in Philadelphia, to the woman I was then, it feels like a lifetime ago." "You saved my life," Harrison said, "not for the first time, never for the last. You know that, do not you? I was nothing before you, I had nothing. You gave me everything." "We gave each other everything," Grace corrected gently. "We saved each other, Harrison. You think I did not need saving too?" "I was drowning in that little house in Philadelphia, suffocating under my aunt's judgment and the gray sameness of every day. Your letters were like a lifeline, pulling me toward something better. And then you gave me this." She gestured around them at the ranch, the mountains, the sky. "This beautiful life, this home, this family. We saved each other." Harrison pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I am the luckiest man who ever lived," he said. "That is the truth of it. The day you wrote back to my advertisement, the day you said yes to coming west, the day you stepped off that stage. Every single one of those days, I became the luckiest man alive." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, wrapped in the quilt, wrapped in their memories, wrapped in the love that had sustained them for a quarter century. Finally, Grace spoke again. "You remember what you wrote in your last letter, the one where you proposed?" "I remember every word," Harrison said. "You said our lives would not be complete until we were together. You were right. My life was not complete until that moment when you held me, that moment when I finally came home, and every day since has been the gift of that completeness. The gift of being exactly where I am meant to be, with exactly who I am meant to be with." "Every day," Harrison agreed. "Every single day I wake up grateful. Grateful that you wrote back, grateful that you came, grateful that you are mine and I am yours." More years passed, bringing more changes. Harrison and Grace gradually turned over the running of the ranch to Henry, stepping back to enjoy their later years with less responsibility and more time for the things they loved. They traveled a little, visiting Hope in California, spending time with each of their children and the growing number of grandchildren. But they always came home to their ranch, to the house they had built together, to the place that had become the center of their world. They celebrated their 30th anniversary, then their 35th. Their children gave them a party for their 40th, a huge gathering that brought family from all over, including some of Grace's cousins from Philadelphia who had finally made the journey west. Harrison stood and gave a speech, thanking everyone for coming, thanking his children for the extraordinary blessing they had been, thanking God or fate or whatever force in the universe had brought him and Grace together. "People sometimes ask me if I was scared," he said, "marrying a woman I had never met. And the answer is yes, I was terrified, but I was more scared of not taking the chance. I was more scared of living my whole life without knowing what it felt like to be truly known, truly loved." Grace gave me that through her letters, and then she gave me everything else by having the courage to come west and be my wife. She is the bravest person I have ever known, and she has made every day of the last 40 years an adventure and a joy. I love you, Grace. I loved you before I met you, and I will love you forever. Grace was crying openly, and so were many of the guests. She stood and went to Harrison, and he held her while everyone cheered and applauded, this couple who had built something beautiful and lasting from letters and faith and courage. That night, lying in bed, Grace said, "We should write our story down, for the grandchildren and great-grandchildren, so they know how we found each other." "I think the quilt tells it pretty well," Harrison said with a smile. "The quilt tells part of it," Grace agreed. "But I want them to know the whole story. I want them to know that sometimes the most important things in life require risk and faith. I want them to know that love is not always easy or simple, but when it is real, when it is true, it is worth everything." So they did. Together, they wrote their story, trading the pen back and forth, adding their different perspectives, their memories and thoughts and feelings. It took them months, working on it in the evenings, reading passages to each other, laughing at how young and uncertain they had been, marveling at how it had all worked out. When it was finished, they made copies for each of their children and several more for the grandchildren when they were old enough to appreciate it. The story became part of the family legacy, passed down through generations, a testament to the power of words and courage and love. Harrison and Grace lived into their 70s, spending their final years surrounded by family, by love, by the life they had built together. They remained devoted to each other until the very end, still holding hands, still finding ways to show their love every single day. When Harrison died at 76, peacefully in his sleep with Grace beside him, the entire family gathered to mourn and celebrate his life. Grace was devastated but also grateful, grateful for every moment they had shared, every year they had been given. At his funeral, she read from one of his letters, her voice steady despite her tears. "My life did not begin until I read your first letter," she read, "and it will not be complete until you are here beside me." She paused, looking up at the gathered family. "He wrote that to me before we ever met, and it was true every day of our marriage. We completed each other. We made each other whole. I am grateful beyond measure for the life we shared, for the love that sustained us, for every precious day we were given together." Grace lived another 3 years, spending them with her children and grandchildren, telling stories about Harrison, keeping his memory alive. But everyone could see that part of her had gone with him, that she was waiting to be reunited with the man who had been her home, her heart, her everything. When she died at 79, also peacefully in her sleep, the family laid her to rest beside Harrison in the small cemetery on the ranch, under a cottonwood tree with a view of the mountains they had both loved. The headstone reads simply, "Grace Thompson Blake, beloved wife, mother, grandmother. She came west for love and found home." Years later, decades later, their great-grandchildren would still tell the story of Harrison and Grace, of the cowboy who wrote letters to a woman he never met, of the woman who was brave enough to travel across the country to marry him, of their first embrace that felt like coming home. The letters themselves were preserved, kept safe in the family archives, and the quilt was carefully maintained and displayed, a tangible reminder of a love that had created a legacy far beyond anything Harrison and Grace could have imagined when they wrote those first tentative words to each other. The ranch remained in the family, passed down through the generations, and the house Harrison and Grace built remained standing, maintained and loved by each new generation that called it home. In the study, the wooden box that Harrison made still held the original letters, faded now but still readable, still powerful in their simple expressions of hope and longing and love. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun was setting and the mountains turned purple and gold, visitors to the ranch swore they could see two figures on the old porch, sitting close together, wrapped in a quilt, watching the stars emerge in the desert sky. Just two people who had found each other across distance and uncertainty, who had built a life and a love that transcended time itself, who had come home to each other and never, ever left. The story of Harrison and Grace became more than just family legend. It was a reminder that the most important connections are not about physical proximity or instant attraction, but about truly knowing another person's heart. It was a testament to the power of words to bridge any distance, to create understanding and intimacy and love. It was proof that sometimes the biggest risks yield the greatest rewards, that courage and faith can transform lives in ways we never imagined possible. Their descendants carried this legacy forward, approaching their own relationships with thoughtfulness and intention, looking for the kind of deep connection their ancestors had found. Some of them also corresponded with potential partners, writing letters even in an age when it was no longer strictly necessary, wanting to emulate that foundation of truly knowing each other before moving forward. Others simply approached love with the same courage and openness that Harrison and Grace had shown, willing to take risks, willing to be vulnerable, willing to believe in something that might seem impossible but might also be exactly right. The ranch prospered through the generations, adapting to changing times while maintaining the core values Harrison had established and Grace had reinforced. Values of hard work and fairness and treating people and animals with respect. The family grew and spread with branches in different states, different walks of life, but they all knew where they came from, all knew the story of the letters and the first embrace and the life that followed. On the 100th anniversary of Harrison and Grace's wedding, the family gathered at the ranch for a massive reunion. Hundreds of people descended on the property, filling the house and yard, camping in tents in the fields, all of them connected by their descent from that cowboy and the woman from Philadelphia who had dared to follow her heart west. The oldest members of the family, those who had actually known Harrison and Grace, were few now, but they were treated with reverence and respect, asked to share their memories. One of Grace's granddaughters, now elderly herself, stood and addressed the crowd. "I was just a little girl when Grandmother Grace died," she said, "but I remember her so clearly. She was always smiling, always had time for us children, always made us feel loved and special. And she talked about Grandfather Harrison constantly, even after he was gone. She would tell us about the letters, about traveling west, about seeing him for the first time. And she always said the same thing. When he held me, I knew I was finally home. That is what love is. It is finding the person who makes you feel like you have finally arrived where you were always meant to be." The crowd was silent, listening, absorbing the wisdom of ancestors they had never met but who had shaped their lives in profound ways. "We are all here because of their courage," the granddaughter continued. "Because Grandfather Harrison dared to write to a stranger, and because Grandmother Grace dared to respond, and then dared to travel thousands of miles to marry a man she had never met. They built something beautiful together, something that has lasted far beyond their own lives. And I think the best way we can honor them is to live our own lives with the same courage, the same openness to possibility, the same willingness to take risks for love." The gathering erupted in applause, and then someone began to sing, an old song that had been popular in Harrison and Grace's time, and others joined in until the desert air was filled with music and voices, a celebration of love and legacy and family. That night, after the crowd had dispersed to their various sleeping arrangements, a smaller group gathered in the old house. These were the direct descendants, the ones who bore the Blake name or had married into it, the ones who felt the weight and privilege of carrying this legacy forward. They sat in the parlor where Harrison and Grace had spent so many evenings, and they passed around the letters, reading them aloud, marveling at the voices of their ancestors, at the love and hope and vulnerability contained in those pages. "It is remarkable," one of them said, "that something as simple as letters could create all of this." He gestured around at the gathered family, at the house, at the legacy that surrounded them. "It was not the letters themselves," another responded, one of the family historians who had studied Harrison and Grace's story extensively. "It was what the letters represented, the willingness to be vulnerable, to share your true self with another person. The courage to believe in something you could not see or touch yet. The faith that real connection is possible even across great distances. Those are the things that created this. The letters were just the medium." They talked late into the night, sharing their own stories, their own journeys to love and family, the ways in which Harrison and Grace's example had influenced their choices and their lives. And as the night deepened and the conversation flowed, there was a sense of connection, of continuity, of being part of something larger than themselves. The next morning, before the final gathering and the eventual dispersal of the family back to their scattered homes, a dedication ceremony was held. The family had pooled resources to create a small museum on the ranch property, a place where Harrison and Grace's letters and other memorabilia would be preserved and protected, where future generations could come and learn about their remarkable love story. The museum was housed in a small building designed to echo the original adobe house where Harrison had first brought Grace, and it contained not just the letters but photographs, the famous quilt, pages from the written memoir Harrison and Grace had created late in their lives, and accounts from their children and grandchildren. It was a labor of love, this museum, and as they cut the ribbon and opened the doors, there was a sense that Harrison and Grace's story had been ensured for future generations, that it would not be lost to time. The family reunion eventually ended, with promises to gather again, to stay connected, to honor the legacy they had inherited. But the impact of those few days together rippled outward, strengthening bonds, renewing commitments to family and to the values Harrison and Grace had embodied. In the years that followed, the museum became a destination not just for family members but for others who heard the story and wanted to learn more. Couples planning to marry would sometimes visit, reading the letters, absorbing the lesson that real love requires knowing another person's heart. Scholars came to study the letters as historical documents, as insights into life in the late 19th century American West. Romance novelists came seeking inspiration, finding in Harrison and Grace's story a powerful reminder of what makes love stories resonate across time. But most importantly, the family continued to grow and thrive, each generation adding their own chapters to the story while remaining rooted in the foundation Harrison and Grace had laid. They married and had children, built businesses and careers, faced challenges and celebrated triumphs. All of it connected back to that first letter, to that first embrace, to the choice two young people made to take a chance on something uncertain and beautiful and absolutely right. The ranch itself continued to stand as a symbol of what could be built on a foundation of love and hard work. The land was cared for with respect and attention. The cattle raised with the same methods Harrison had pioneered, the house and buildings maintained with pride. New generations lived on the property, raised their children there, found their own sense of home in the place Harrison and Grace had created. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the family gathered on the porch to watch the sunset, they would sometimes talk about Harrison and Grace, about the letters and the courage and the love that started it all. Parents would tell their children the story, making sure it was never forgotten, making sure each new generation understood where they came from and what it meant. Your great-great-great-grandfather Harrison was just a lonely cowboy, they would say, working on a ranch in Arizona, thinking that maybe this was all there was. And your great-great-great-grandmother Grace was a seamstress in Philadelphia, feeling trapped and wondering if her life would ever really begin. And then they started writing letters. Just letters, ink on paper, words from the heart. And those words changed everything. They found each other, even though they were thousands of miles apart. They knew each other's hearts before they ever met. And when they finally did meet, when Harrison held Grace for the first time, it was like coming home. That is what love is. That is what we are all looking for. That sense of being exactly where we belong, with exactly who we are meant to be with. The children would listen, wide-eyed, absorbing the story, and in some cases, it would shape their entire understanding of what love could be, what it should be. They would grow up looking for that connection, that sense of truly knowing and being known, that feeling of coming home. And so Harrison and Grace's legacy continued, growing and spreading, touching lives they would never meet, influencing choices they would never know about, creating ripples that extended far beyond what they could have imagined in those early days of tentative correspondence. The letters themselves remained at the heart of it all, preserved and protected, read and reread by generation after generation. Some of the passages became family sayings, repeated so often they took on the weight of Scripture. We know each other's hearts. My life began with your first letter. When he held me, I came home. These phrases were quoted at weddings, included in anniversary toasts, whispered to children at bedtime. They became woven into the fabric of the family's identity, reminders of where they came from and what they believed about love and connection and courage. As the 21st century arrived, bringing with it changes and challenges that Harrison and Grace never could have imagined, their story remained relevant and powerful. In an age of instant communication and superficial connections, the tale of a cowboy and a seamstress who took the time to truly know each other before committing their lives to one another felt more important than ever. It was a counter-narrative to the culture of speed and disposability, a reminder that the most important things take time and intention and vulnerability. The museum expanded, adding interactive elements and educational programs, becoming a resource for teaching about both the history of the American West and the timeless nature of human connection. Schools brought students to visit, and many young people left with a different understanding of what love and commitment could mean. And through it all, the ranch remained, the house remained, the legacy remained. Harrison and Grace's great-great-great-grandchildren walked the same land they had walked, looked at the same mountains, watched the same stars emerge in the desert sky. They faced different challenges and lived in a different world, but they carried forward the core truth their ancestors had discovered. That real love, the kind that lasts, the kind that creates and sustains and transforms, is built on truly knowing another person's heart. On what would have been Harrison and Grace's 150th wedding anniversary, the family held another gathering, smaller than the centennial but no less meaningful. They gathered at the cemetery, at the graves of their ancestors, and each person placed a flower on the plot until it was covered in blooms, a riot of color against the desert landscape. The current patriarch of the family, himself elderly now, a direct descendant through Harrison and Grace's son Henry, stood and addressed the gathering. "We are here today to remember and honor the love story that made all of our lives possible," he said. Harrison and Grace took a chance on each other, and in doing so, they created something that has lasted far beyond their own lives. They showed us that real love requires courage, that it requires vulnerability, that it requires being willing to risk everything for the possibility of finding the person who makes you feel like you have come home. They were not perfect people. They made mistakes, faced challenges, struggled with doubts, but they chose each other every day for more than 40 years. And that choice, that commitment, that love is what we celebrate today. He paused, looking around at the gathered family, spanning multiple generations, all of them connected by the decision two people made more than a century and a half ago. "We carry their story forward," he continued. "We honor them not just by remembering, but by living our own lives with the same courage and commitment they showed. When we choose our partners, when we commit to our families, when we build our homes and our lives, we are continuing what Harrison and Grace started. We are adding our own verses to the poem they began. And someday, when we are gone, our descendants will gather here and remember us, and hopefully, they will say that we, too, lived with love and courage and contributed something good to this legacy we have inherited." The gathering stood in silence for a moment, absorbing his words, feeling the weight and beauty of the legacy they carried. Then, spontaneously, people began to share their own stories, their own experiences of how Harrison and Grace's example had influenced their lives. Couples talked about reading the letters together before getting engaged, about using the story as a model for building their own relationships. Parents talked about teaching their children about the importance of truly knowing someone before committing to them. Grandparents talked about the stability and love that had characterized their own long marriages, and how they traced it back to the example set so long ago. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple, the family gradually dispersed, heading back to their various homes and lives, carrying with them a renewed sense of connection to each other and to the story that bound them together. The ranch continued into the future, adapted and modernized where necessary, but always respectful of its history and heritage. The museum remained a vital part of the property, attracting visitors from around the world who heard about the remarkable love story and wanted to learn more. Harrison and Grace's letters were eventually digitized and made available online, allowing people everywhere to read the words that had started it all, to be inspired by the courage and vulnerability and hope contained in those pages. And though the world changed in countless ways, though technology advanced and society evolved, and the challenges people faced took different forms, the fundamental truth at the heart of Harrison and Grace's story remained constant and relevant. That real love is built on truly knowing another person's heart, that the greatest rewards often require the greatest risks, And that finding the person who makes you feel like you have come home is worth whatever it takes to find them. The story of the cowboy who wrote letters to a woman he never met, and of the woman who was brave enough to travel across the country to embrace him, continued to inspire and challenge and comfort people generations removed from the original events. It stood as a testament to the power of words, of courage, of faith, and above all, of love. And somewhere, in the way the desert wind moved through the cottonwoods, in the way the light fell across the old house at sunset, in the way the family gathered and shared stories and passed down the legacy, Harrison and Grace lived on, their love not diminished by time but instead strengthened and expanded, touching lives and hearts far beyond what they had ever imagined possible on that September day in 1881 when they first held each other and finally came home.